Good afternoon. Can you hear me? All right, wonderful. I'm Clarence Lang, Dean of the College of the Liberal Arts here at Penn State, and on behalf of the McCourtney Institute for Democracy, along with co-sponsors the Richard Civil War Era Center, the Humanities Institute, and the Africana Research Center, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's event. That includes those here, those of you here at the State Theater, and those watching online. But to all, welcome. After the presentation, Jenna Spinelli, who produces the McCourtney Institute's Democracy Works podcast, will lead a question and answer session. So if you are here in person, please queue in front of the microphones on both sides of the stage. If you are online, please submit your questions in the chat. We will, of course, try to get to as many as we can after this event. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this afternoon. Carol Anderson is the Charles Howard Candler Professor of African American Studies at Emory University. She is an historian whose work confronts the legacies and contemporary manifestations of racism and inequality in U.S. social policy. The author of 6 books, many of them award-winning, Professor Anderson has appeared on CNN, MSNBC, Democracy Now!, and other programs. Her many op-eds, meanwhile, have appeared in The Guardian, Time Magazine, The Washington Post, and other venues. The book that Professor Anderson is going to speak about today is entitled One Person, No Vote: How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy. This work makes a compelling case. It compellingly documents the long history of voter suppression, intimidation, and violence against African Americans trying to exercise the vote, and the impact that that has on democracy for populations across the board. That history was an indelible part of the Jim Crow South, but Anderson's work shows the continuing patterns of that suppression to this very day and to the detriment of our society. As you may know, One Person, No Vote was published in 2019, and it was long listed for the National Book Award and a finalist for the Penn Galbraith Award in nonfiction. All of this was occurring when the McCourtney Institute invited Professor Anderson to come speak to us. Unfortunately, the COVID pandemic forced us to postpone Professor Anderson's talk not once, but 3 times. During the intervening period, state legislatures across the nation redoubled their efforts to enforce racial subordination. But this period was also one in which Professor Anderson was busy. She had time to finish another book, this one entitled The Second: Race and Guns in a Fatally Unequal America. That work documents the history of the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, as a similar systematic effort to advance white racial domination. What has not changed from the time of our invitation until now, however, is the importance of Professor Anderson's work and our eagerness to have her on campus, and in this case, 4th time is apparently the charm. And let me just say, having known Carol for a number of years, she does such weighty work, but she's actually, as I think you're going to see today, a really fun person. So please join me in welcoming Carol Anderson to Penn State.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for caring about democracy. And I want to thank Penn State and the McCourtney Center for bringing me here and for such a wonderful, wonderful day. It has been a fabulous day. But I'm going to talk about something that's not so fabulous right now. I'm going to talk about voter suppression. I'm going to talk about the disfranchisement of American citizens, the denial of the rights of American citizens to the ballot box. When we often think of it, we think in terms of the violence that rained down on black folks who were trying to vote. I think of like Maceo Snipes, who was a veteran, World War II veteran, and it was 1946 Georgia. And Maceo had fought the fascists in the Pacific. And 46 was a gubernatorial election in Georgia. And he came home from fighting in that war, and he was determined to get some of that democracy for himself. And so he was going to vote. But Gene Talmadge was running for governor. And Gene Talmadge was running on a platform, you keep the Negro right where they belong. And Maceo Snipes was like, well, I know where I belong. I belong where American citizens are, in the voting booth. And so Maceo sashayed up to the voting booth, and he was going to vote. But there was a sign over the door that said something to the effect of, the first Negro that votes, that'll be the last thing he ever does. And Maceo was like, shh, I fought fascists. What you got? And he walked on in there, and he cast his ballot. He was the only black person to vote in Taylor County, Georgia, in 1946. But Maceo goes home, nothing. He's like, okay, cool. A few days later, knock on the door. Maceo goes to the door, he opens it up, and there was a white man on the porch saying, could you step out? Maceo's like, sure. He steps out on the porch, 3 additional white men show up, and you hear, ch-ch. It was a firing squad. And they gunned Maceo Snipes down. It took him days to die. But the message was clear. You vote, you die. You vote, you die. You vote, you die. That's the kind of physical violence we often think about with disfranchisement. But I want to talk about another type of violence, bureaucratic violence. The bureaucratic violence that seems legitimate, that wraps itself in the law and legalities and processes and procedures, that looks so routine, mundane, but is absolutely doing the corrosive work of destroying American democracy. So I know you're going to be surprised, but I'm going to start this off in Mississippi. In Mississippi in 1890, Mississippi legislators looked up and they were absolutely concerned. There were more black eligible voters than there were white eligible voters in Mississippi by like 30,000 or so. Whew. And you had poor blacks and poor whites who were joining together, voting in representatives who cared about poor people. The Mississippi legislature looked up and said, oh, we can't have this. How are we going to stop this? And so they started talking about voter fraud, voter fraud, voter fraud. We've got to clean up all of this corruption at the ballot box. We must have election integrity. And the way that we're going to clean up this fraud at the ballot box is to rewrite our voting laws. And they came up with something that was called the Mississippi Plan of 1890. The Mississippi Plan sounded legitimate voter fraud, and we're trying to protect democracy. And so the measures that we have are really innocuous, but they're designed to bring integrity to the system. And they're not too much. So you had the poll tax. And what these measures did was they didn't want black folks to vote. That was really clear. But the 15th Amendment that said the state shall not abridge the right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And so how does Mississippi write a law saying we don't want black folks to vote without writing a law that says we don't want black folks to vote? And Mississippi says, I got it, I got it. What we're going to do is we're going to use the legacies of slavery and make those legacies the access point to the ballot box. And we're going to make it sound legitimate. And so you have the poll tax. And the poll tax says, democracy is expensive. All of these elections, you've got to have people who are taking the ballots, people who are counting the ballots. You have to have the buildings where people are voting. I mean, it's just expensive. And so if you really cared about democracy, you would be willing to pay a small fee. Now, you see how that language flips the responsibility of holding a free and fair election on the citizen and not on the state. Because if you, the citizen, really care, you would be willing to pay a small fee. Now, how that plays into it is that after centuries of slavery, centuries of unpaid labor, followed by the black codes after the Civil War, followed by sharecropping, access to the income to pay the poll tax was disparate. Black folks, for the most part, did not have it. And in fact, this nominal poll tax amounted to 2 to 6% of a Mississippi farm family's annual income. Imagine paying 2 to 6% of your annual income to vote. But that was the poll tax. And then there was the literacy test. The literacy test said, you know, we want engaged citizens who know our values, who know our laws. We don't think it's too much to ask for them to be able to read a section of the Constitution of the United States or part of the state constitution. It's not too much to ask. Well, remember, over hundreds of years of slavery, literacy would get a black person killed or tortured. Then you had, after the Civil War, decidedly unequally funded black schools. So literacy, which the state is not providing, becomes the access point to the ballot box. But it's not too much to ask. You also had other mechanisms, such as the white primary, which South Carolina came up with, the understanding clause, the good character clause. All of these things combined, you had the U.S. Supreme Court in 1898 rule that the poll tax and the literacy test did not violate the 15th Amendment because everybody had to pay the poll tax and everybody had to be able to read the Constitution. Now, the thing about the literacy test is that it required sometimes not just being able to read the Constitution, but whatever unanswerable question the registrar wanted to ask you. So Mississippi was notorious for asking, how many bubbles in a bar of soap? Anybody in here can answer that question? I don't think anybody in here is going to be able to vote. Or the question, the man who helped raise me, he's from Georgia, and his literacy test question was, how high is up? So when the state is asking you an unanswerable question, and that unanswerable question is your access to your voting rights, you're seeing the massive corrosive effects on democracy. By 1940, the Second World War is underway. By 1940, only 3% of age-eligible African Americans were registered to vote. Only 3%. That gives you some sense of the power of the Mississippi Plan and the Supreme Court's ruling that the literacy test and the poll tax did not violate the 15th Amendment. This is why you see that incredible push during the civil rights movement for the right to vote that leads to that cinematic, cataclysmic violence on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma on Bloody Sunday, where you see nonviolent protesters who are protesting against their denial of the right to vote by symbolically carrying the casket of a freedom fighter who was gunned down, Jimmy Lee Jackson, carrying his casket symbolically to George Wallace's doorstep, Governor George Wallace's doorstep. And they are met by the Alabama Patrol and by Sheriff Jim Clark and his deputies. And we see that violence. We see the men on horseback with whips, and we see the tear gas. We see these nonviolent protesters being trampled over. And what we then see is that the cameras are rolling, and they are capturing this incredible, horrific violence. It shocked the nation, stunned the nation. So much so that ABC cut into its movie of the week, Judgment at Nuremberg, to show the footage from Bloody Sunday. That footage led to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was landmark legislation. What it did was that it said that any state or jurisdiction that had a history of discriminating against its citizens could not just implement any voting law that it cavalierly wanted to, but had to get the okay first from the Department of Justice or the federal courts in DC before implementing the law, before that law could take effect and begin to cauterize the electorate, begin to shut out American citizens from the ballot box as these elections are going on, and then folks who had come to power based on disfranchisement, who then have a stake in perpetuating those policies, continue to perpetuate those policies. So the Voting Rights Act was designed to cut through all of that mess that had been happening and say, no, you have got to get pre-cleared first. The Voting Rights Act was powerful. In 1965, about 5 to 7% of African Americans in Mississippi were registered to vote. Now, you know Mississippi got some black folk. And when you only got 5 to 7% registered to vote, you know that disfranchisement is doing its work. 2 years after the Voting Rights Act, almost 60% of African Americans in Mississippi were registered to vote. So you can imagine that is so transformational that it's like the empire strikes back. That's the story, that's the saga of voting rights in America. In this empire strikes back, we have these consistent challenges that are happening over and over and over. And still, the Voting Rights Act continues to get reauthorized, but underneath there's this current of massive discontent with it. But we don't see it. Particularly, we didn't see it in 2008 when Barack Obama was elected to the presidency. The United States did this, woo, we have crossed the racial Rubicon. Woo, we have overcome. This was a day like for Martin Luther King. Wow, look at us. Look at what we did. That story wasn't quite accurate, because what that story was saying is, look at this. The majority of whites in America who voted to put a black man in the White House. Racism is a thing of the past. Except the majority of whites in America who voted did not vote for Obama. In fact, the majority of whites who voted have not voted for a Democratic candidate for president since 1964, since Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. So you might ask yourself, how did Obama get elected if the most whites didn't vote for him? Because Obama, I know you asked yourself that question, I heard you. Because Obama had an incredible ground game that was grassroots organizing that brought millions of new voters to the ballot box. They were overwhelmingly African American, Hispanic, Asian American, young, and the poor. That would become the hit list for voter suppression. And it was the US Supreme Court's decision in 2013, Shelby County v. Holder, that made that voter suppression real. What the US Supreme Court said in that landmark decision was that racism really is a thing of the past. It's not like it was in America. We don't do that anymore. And so you've got this old law and you've got these new circumstances, and ne'er the twain shall meet. So you need to come up with a new law to meet our new circumstances. And the Voting Rights Act picks on the South. Now, when I was little, I used to hit my brother all the time. And at a certain point, my brother would hit me back. I know, shocking. And he would hit me back, and I'd go run it to my mother. Mommy, Wendell's picking on me. And she'd say, what are you doing to make yourself so pickable? Well, when you're talking about folks are picking on the South, you've got to ask, what are you doing to make yourself so pickable? Because in the 2006 reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, the Department of Justice brought before Congress over 700 policy changes that it had stopped from 1982 to like 2005 over 700 policy changes it had stopped because they were racially discriminatory. What are you doing to make yourself so pickable? So right after the Shelby County v. Holder decision passed, boom, it was like, who let the dogs out? You can go woof, 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 woof. Who let the dogs out? Because Texas, 2 hours afterwards, passed. It implemented its voter ID law. Now, the thing about voter ID, I'm going to have to take us back to the 2000 election. Everybody remember that 2000 election? And what we remember are hanging chads, right? And we remember the Bush v. Gore decision where the U.S. Supreme Court stepped in and stopped the recount in Florida, and George W. Bush became president of the United States. Well, what we don't remember is what happened in Missouri in that 2000 election. And that becomes central to the way that we have to live now. In that 2000 election, the St. Louis Board of Elections illegally purged almost 50,000 voters from the rolls, just removed them from the voting rolls, didn't tell them. And so when they showed up to vote and their names aren't on the books, and so the poll workers are like, "Arr," and would send people down to the Board of Elections. And so you had the Board of Elections packed with these voters trying to get back on the rolls so that they could vote. And it's taking hours upon hours upon hours, and the polls are getting ready to close. So the Democrats sue to keep the polls open longer because all of those folks who have been trapped down at the Board of Elections have not had an opportunity to vote. The judge agrees, saying it's not their fault, it's not their fault, and agrees to allow the polls to stay open 3 hours longer. The Republicans immediately come in with a countersuit to another judge, saying this is an attempt to steal the election. This is an attempt at massive, rampant voter fraud. And the judge shuts down the polls at 7:45. Now, Senator Kit Bond, U.S. Senator Kit Bond, began to ride that hobby horse of massive, rampant voter fraud. He talked about, we had dead people voting. We had dogs voting. We had people using addresses from vacant lots and coming in with different baseball caps, disguising themselves and voting over and over and over. They were trying to steal this election. He took that language of stealing the election into Congress. And so when Congress was crafting the Help America Vote Act, which was supposed to reinstill confidence in the American people that our election systems actually worked, because folks were looking at Florida going, Lord have mercy, they can't even count. Woo! And so it was like to reinstill that confidence in the American people. The Help America Vote Act dealt with some of the anomalies we saw in Florida, the realities of what we saw in Florida. But what it also dealt with was the lie of voter fraud. Kit Bond rode that hobby horse so hard that embedded in federal law is the possibility for voter ID to counter voter fraud, saying that states could require voter ID. That's where this comes from. So you get Texas 2 hours after the Shelby County v. Holder decision implementing its voter ID law. Now, let me go back to the voter fraud question. We hear it, it's ubiquitous, voter fraud, voter fraud, voter fraud, stealing the election, voter fraud, voter fraud, voter fraud, that so many Americans believe that it actually happens, that there's a prevalence of it. But Justin Levitt, a law professor out of California, did a study. He found that from 2000 to 2014, out of 1 billion votes cast in elections in the United States, and that's Carl Saganish, right? Billions of votes. There were 31 cases of voter impersonation fraud. Over 15 years and 1 billion votes, 31 cases. That's the foundation for massive, rampant voter fraud. The voter ID law uses the same kind of tactics that we see in the Mississippi Plan of 1890. It says, our democracy is under threat. We have massive, rampant voter fraud. We have all of this corruption happening at the ballot box. And so in order to save democracy, in order to bring about election integrity, we don't think it's too much to ask for people just to show an ID to prove they are, who they say they are. Well, that sounds so innocuous, and it plays to a middle-class norm, because everybody has an ID. I mean, that's what, I need an ID to cash a check. I need an ID to be able to fly out. I need an ID to be able to go to the bank. We hear this, I need an ID. But the types of IDs that are required you cannot vote with your library card. You cannot vote with your Kroger grocery store card. Although we did have a president who believed that you needed ID to go to the grocery store. These states would craft the IDs based on racial disparities. They figured out who had what types of IDs and made certain types of IDs the access to the ballot box. So, for instance, driver's licenses. In Texas required government-issued photo ID. So that's not your bank statement. That's not your utility statement. That's a government-issued photo ID. What Texas knew was that 1/3 of its counties did not have a driver's license bureau, and people were going to have to make a 250-mile round trip in order to be able to get a driver's license. So ask yourself, if you don't have a driver's license and you don't have public transportation to get that 250 miles round trip, how do you get the driver's license? And what Texas did was Texas, in its original bill, had a reimbursement clause in that bill, saying they would reimburse folks for having to make that 250-mile round trip. Before the law passed, they put a red line through that reimbursement clause. So you're going to have to pocket that yourself. What the NAACP Legal Defense Fund figured out was that there were 600,000 people in Texas who did not have the driver's license. 600,000. And now, how are they going to get there? And what Texas also did was to say your student ID from a state university does not count as a government-issued photo ID. But your concealed weapon card does. Students, Gun owners, oh yeah. So you see how you can begin to craft your electorate by crafting the kinds of IDs that people have to have in order to vote. That's what these states are doing, but it sounds innocuous. Let's take Alabama. Alabama says you have to have a government-issued photo ID to vote. But Alabama said your public housing ID doesn't count. Now, does it get more government issued than public housing? So how is it that your public housing ID doesn't count? Because 71% of those in public housing in Alabama are African American. And the NAACP Legal Defense Fund figured out that for most of them, it was the only government-issued photo ID they had. And so now it's about driver's licenses. Now, when you think about driver's licenses, that means you own a car or you have access to a car. Cars are expensive. You've got the note, you've got maintenance, you've got gas, you've got insurance, you've got parking. Cars are expensive. And so when you have disparity in income, you have disparity in ownership of private vehicles. So now, though, because your public housing ID doesn't count and you want to vote, then you're thinking, okay, well, I'll go get a driver's license. Well, Governor Bentley, listening to his mistress, and I'm like, Lord, what kind of pillow talk? Baby, yes, baby, You know what I want? What, baby? I want you to shut down the Department of Motor Vehicles in the Black Belt counties. Okay. And that's what he did. And he did it, what he said, for fiscal reasons. You know, the state was running a deficit, and we had to balance the budget. And these departments of motor vehicles weren't getting a lot of traffic through there, and so it just made fiscal sense to close them down. What that meant then were that the nearest driver's license bureaus were 50 miles away. And so I say to you again, if you don't have a driver's license, you don't have public transportation. Alabama is ranked 48th in the nation in public transportation. How do you go a 100-mile round trip to get the driver's license that you need in order to vote? That's the power of voter ID. What the states also did after Shelby County v. Holder. So we're in the 21st century. I just want to be real clear about this. This is this targeted hit. Is it began to shut down early voting stations. Now, what early voting does is, you know, when the election is on that second Tuesday in November, that's a day when lots of people are working. And if you have to punch a clock, being able to get to the polls during that time when the polls are open, when you've got to, so let's take Atlanta. Atlanta is big. And the black neighborhood, there's a sizable black neighborhood here, and Emory is one of the state's largest employers. It's here. To be able to get from here to there in Atlanta traffic, to be able to get to work on time when the polls open at 7 and you have to be at work by 8, in the words of that Nobel poet laureate, Aretha Franklin, ain't no way. It's not gonna happen. And so what early voting does is it opens up access to the ballot box for working class people who have to punch a clock. What these states did was to shut down these early voting sites. They shut down the number of days. And so in North Carolina, they went through, in Florida as well, they went through and looked at the racial data about what days were African Americans using the most to vote early. And they removed those days. Said, nah, that's not an early voting day anymore. Or what they did in Ohio, right next door. Ohio said, oh, we're going to be equitable. There's going to be one early voting site for every county. All 88 counties will have one early voting site. That sounds reasonable. Remember, Jim Crow sounded reasonable. This mess sounds reasonable. The problem is Cuyahoga County, which is where Cleveland is, has 1.2 million people. Franklin County, where Columbus, Ohio is, has over 1 million people. Hamilton County, where Cincinnati is, has 800,000 people. Pickaway County, with that thriving metropolis, Circleville, has 60,000 people. So you put one early voting station for a county with over 1 million people and one early voting station for a county that has 60,000 people. And you begin to see the inequity in being equitable. It does what it's supposed to do. The line in Hamilton County stretched 1/4 mile to vote. Pickaway County, in and out. In North Carolina looked at counties that had sizable black populations and began shutting down the early voting sites. They shut them down so much so that they applauded themselves, the Republicans applauded themselves, that early voting had gone down in 2016 by 8%. Black folks voting early had gone down by 8% because there had been 22 early voting sites, and they shut that down to a handful, to like 4. Or let's take Indiana. So remember in the 2008 election, Indiana went for Obama. I mean, and so there were folks who were like, whoo! And there were folks who were like clutching their heart, like Fred Sanford, Lisbeth, whoa, what happened? How did that happen? Well, the legislature started culling through the data to figure out how on earth did Indiana go for Obama. What they figured out were that African Americans in Indianapolis, in Marion County, had used early voting overwhelmingly, and that was the margin of difference. So the state legislature passed a law saying that counties that had over 325,000 residents could only have one early voting site. Counties that had fewer could get more. Now, if you've got over 325,000 residents, you get one. If you have fewer, you get more. Now, there are only 3 counties in Indiana that have more than 325,000 people. Those counties have the cities of Gary, Fort Wayne, and Indianapolis. Those 3 cities account for almost 70% of the state's black population. If you can limit that population to one early voting site, you can transform the results of an election. And that is exactly what happened in 2012 and in 2016. Then we have purges. Purges are when states remove registered voters from the polls. And again, this is going to sound very clinical, very necessary, very mundane, very routine, very bureaucratic. Of course we have to keep the voter rolls clean. You know, we've got to remove dead people from the rolls. Duh. We've got to remove people from our voter registration rolls who have moved out of the state. That's logical. But what these states did was they went after voters who did not vote regularly and said, we haven't heard from you, so obviously you must not be a real voter, purge. Now, when you look statistically, what the research shows is that who doesn't vote regularly? Young people, poor people, minorities. It is a way to begin to remove young people, poor people, minorities from the voter rolls, simply because they haven't voted regularly. And so I'm like, so if I don't go to church every Sunday, do I lose my right to freedom of religion? If I don't carry a gun, do I lose my Second Amendment rights? But if I don't vote regularly, I am removed from the voter rolls. Millions have been removed from the voter rolls. There's another process that is used in these purges. That was interstate cross-check. Interstate cross-check was the baby of Chris Kobach coming out of Kansas. And the way that it worked is it sounded very routine and mundane. It said, you know, we're trying to stop this massive, rampant voter fraud. These people who are going from state to state, voting, stealing our elections. So we've got to stop them. And so this looks really clean and really clinical. What it does is it says, okay, so we're going to match up our databases. And we're going to match on first name, last name, suffix, junior, senior, the third, last 4 of your social security, and your birth date. And so if we see that combination registered in Kansas and registered in Texas, boom, you're removed from the rolls. Sounds clean, sounds clinical, sounds beautiful technology. No. The states really didn't bother to look at suffix, so the senior looked like the junior, looked like the third. They didn't bother with the last 4 of your social security. They didn't bother with the birth dates. They barely looked at the first name, but Jose looked like Joseph. And they really honed in on the last name. Well, the thing about the last name in America is that minorities are overrepresented in more than 80% of the most common last names. So if your last name is Washington, there's almost a 90% chance that you're African American. If your last name is Garcia, there's over a 90% chance that you are Hispanic. If your last name is Kim, there's over a 90% chance that you are Asian American. So by honing in on the last name, it allows states to begin to remove African Americans, Hispanics, and Asian Americans from the voter rolls. And so in these purges, millions were removed. African Americans were overrepresented by 45% in those purges. Asian Americans overrepresented by 31%. Hispanics overrepresented by 24%. Whites underrepresented by 8%. This is how you can skew an electorate and look clean, clinical, technological, fair. Then we had felony disfranchisement. In the United States, in 2018, there were more than 6 million Americans who could not vote because of a felony conviction. 1.7 million of them lived in Florida. Florida had over 40%, about 40% of its black men could not vote because of a felony conviction. Over 20% of all African American adults in Florida could not vote because of a felony conviction. And Florida was one of the few states that had permanent felony disfranchisement. So it said once you had a conviction, you could not vote. Now they had some process where after 7 years, you could petition the governor's committee to get your voting rights back. But there was a backlog of tens of thousands of petitioners, and the committee only met 4 times a year. And Rick Scott, when he was the governor, he would ask questions such as, what party do you belong to? Are you a Democrat or are you a Republican? And there's statistics showing that those who came through and said, I'm a Republican, they got their voting rights back at a disproportionately higher amount than those who were Democrats. Equitable. So there was Amendment 4. Amendment 4 in Florida said returning citizens who had not committed murder or rape would get their voting rights back after they had served their complete sentence. That amendment passed by 65% of the voters. Wow. Well, the legislature looked up and said, oh, Shaggy, ooh, we think we got some voters who won't be voting for us. What are we going to do? And so what they came up with was to recraft the definition of having served your sentence. And they said, well, we think completely serving your sentence means that you have paid your fines, your fees, and all restitutions. And folks looked up and said, Lord, that sounds like a poll tax. It smells like a poll tax. It's waddling like a poll tax. And so they went to court. And the 11th Circuit ruled, no, this isn't a poll tax. It's just saying it's the completion of their sentence. And the state does not have to tell them how much they owe. Now, think about that. It is the worst of the poll tax and the worst of the literacy test. Because the poll tax, you've got to pay. The literacy test, the state is asking you an unanswerable question to gain access to your voting rights. How high is up? How much do I owe? And the state doesn't have to tell you. So this was a way, again, of the bureaucratic violence to deny hundreds of thousands of American citizens their right to vote. And then we have partisan gerrymandering. And I'm in Pennsylvania, so I know you know what I mean. Yeah, I heard, this almost sounded like church. I heard an amen coming back. It was like call and response here. Yes. And so the way that partisan gerrymandering works, and so let's take Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, because you know, after the census, then the Constitution says you must redraw the districts to represent the change in population, because that's going to determine who your representatives are. So a state that's gaining in population will get more representatives. A state that is losing in population will have fewer. So the districts get redrawn. So what they did in Wisconsin was that a handful of Republicans locked themselves in a hotel room for basically 4 months with a computer, powerful map drawing software, and something akin to Cambridge Analytic data. So, and they had 2 goals. One was to eliminate as many competitive districts as they could, because with competitive districts, people believe that their vote matters. They believe that their vote counts, and that in these competitive districts, it means that, who I vote for just might get elected. If you eliminate competitive districts and you've got the same old representative that's been there, as my mother would say, since heck was a pup, then it doesn't matter if I vote. So one of the things about voter suppression is it is designed to get into your head to believe that the system is so rigged, it doesn't matter if you vote, because they're going to do what they're going to do anyway. It doesn't matter what I do. So eliminating competitive districts is part of what that is designed to do. The second goal was that regardless of how many votes Republicans get, they will always have the majority of the seats and the power in the legislature. So let me stop and walk through that really slowly about what that means in a democracy. Regardless of how many votes we get, we will always have the majority of the power. So when we're thinking in a democracy, those who get the most votes will have the most seats. No. I'm doing Amy Winehouse now. No. What happened in that first election? They had it was so cloistered that Republicans could only see, who weren't in that little cabal, could only see their own district, and they had to sign a non-disclosure agreement to see it. No Democrats were involved in the this map drawing session. In that first election, Democrats garnered 52% of the vote, and they gained something like 38 or 39% of the seats. 52% gets you less than 40%. Each subsequent election, it got worse. Here in Pennsylvania, 49% of the vote gained the Republicans 72% of the seats in Congress. 49%, 72%. What gerrymandering does is it creates these rotten boroughs. These kinds of where politicians draw the districts so that they get to choose their voters instead of the voters choosing them. And it creates these safe districts. And so you begin to wonder why, when you're looking at the polling data and you're seeing that most Americans want movement on climate change. They want movement on gun safety regulations. They want movement on access to health care. And why you don't see responsiveness from the federal government in that range, you're looking at the power of extreme partisan gerrymandering that allows congressional representatives to not be responsive to voters because they have chosen their voters. Then we have poll closures. Poll closures are also under the guise of being fiscally responsible. After Shelby County v. Holder, 1,688 polls were closed in those jurisdictions that were under the Voting Rights Act. 1,688 polls were closed. What we know is that for every 1/10 of a mile, is that right? 1/10 of a mile that a poll moves from the black community, black voter turnout goes down by 0.5%, up to 4 miles. So in Georgia, they moved one of the black precincts in Sparta 17 miles away. Think about that when you're trying to get to the polls to vote and then get to work. 17 miles away. This is how you can bureaucratically remove millions upon millions of otherwise eligible American citizens from the polls, from their right to vote. And you can make it sound reasonable because folks are only trying to bring about election integrity, because they're only trying to strengthen democracy and stop corruption at the ballot box. And if people really cared about voting, then they would be willing to show an ID. If they really cared about voting, then they would be willing to stand in line. Because one of the things that poll closures did was to funnel more and more people into fewer polling stations with fewer and fewer resources. This is why in Georgia we had 11-hour lines in the 2020 primary. 11 hours to vote. But if you really cared about voting, you would be willing to stand in that line. Because when we treat voting as a privilege and not as an obstacle course, we're not treating voting as a right. And voting is a right. It is a right that is bedrock and foundational to American democracy. And we have to fight for it. Thank you. And Jenna, I'm ready.
Thank you again, Dr. Anderson. Take a seat.
Okay.
And thank you. If you have questions, John and Ben are coming down with the microphones. You can queue up on either side. And as long as I can see the aisles, I will take a question. Those of you watching online, you can put your questions in the YouTube chat. I've got my laptop up here, so we will take questions that way as well. And just a couple of other announcements before we get on with the Q&A here. Just a reminder for those watching or for those in the room with us today, Webster's Bookstore and Cafe here in State College is doing a book sale in the lobby. So as soon as we finish the Q&A here, you can head out and get your books. And Professor Anderson will be doing a book signing. And for those of you watching online, you can find the Webster's bookshop.org link in the Q&A or in the chat box. And just a thank you again to the State Theater staff, Carrie, John, Dan, Ben, everybody else who has made tonight's event possible. So, Professor Anderson, you talked a lot about what has gone wrong in the states, but as we know, the system of federalism that we have here also allows states to do things right. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about what states have done right when it comes to voting?
Absolutely. You have states like Oregon. What Oregon did, Oregon has one of the highest voter turnout rates in the nation. Oregon wasn't satisfied. And Oregon said, we can do better. And they realized that registration was one of the major obstacles, hurdles, that people had to jump over in order to be able to vote. And so Oregon instituted automatic voter registration. So that when you went to the driver's license bureau, when you went to go get your license, you were automatically registered to vote. Oregon, what that did was it increased the diversity of Oregon's electorate, and you had higher voter turnout in Oregon after automatic voter registration. California looked up with its then Secretary of State, Alex Padilla, who is now a U.S. Senator. And Padilla looked up and said, oh, we want some of that. Because California had like a 42% voter turnout rate. Ooh, as I was saying in class today, that's an F. Right, that's an F. And so what California did was it instituted automatic voter registration. But it also added that 16 and 17-year-olds would be pre-registered to vote, so that when they turned 18, they were already registered. So it was getting young folks into the habit of seeing themselves as engaged citizens. Illinois looked up and said, we're going to do you one better. And so not only did you have automatic voter registration, but from the Driver's License Bureau, but you also had it from the social service agencies. So that was, again, to expand access to the ballot box. So you have these states who are asking the question, how can we make voting more accessible to our citizens? How can we do this work? And that is just, wow, that's democracy.
Yeah. We have a question here as well. Can you speak more specifically on federal initiatives to both promote and inhibit voter access?
Okay. I can speak to, we've got, so after the 1988 presidential election, which had the lowest voter turnout since 1924, whoo, folks looked up and said, okay, we got to do better. What are we doing wrong? And so the National Voter Registration Act became the federal response to that low voter turnout. And it's called the Motor Voter Law, so that when you go to the Driver's License Bureau, you can then register to vote. So it's like one-stop shopping. And they have things in there, so the quid pro quo in that was that the Republicans were like, ooh, you're going to have registering all of these people to vote. We've got to have voter roll maintenance. And so voter roll maintenance is in the National Voter Registration Act. And now the Voter Registration Act is very clear. It says you can remove folks from the rolls if they died. Duh. You can remove folks if they have moved out of the jurisdiction. Of course. You cannot remove folks if they haven't voted. So when you get these states then that are removing people from the rolls simply because they haven't voted, they are violating federal law. But a recent Supreme Court decision said, yeah, we're fine with that. So now we have sitting in Congress the Freedom to Vote Act, which is the revised For the People Act. And we also have sitting in Congress the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act deals with the questions that the Supreme Court raised in the 2013 Shelby County v. Holder decision, saying you have antiquated standards for a modern society. So the John Lewis Voting Rights Act updates those standards, saying all of America, it comes under the purview. And these are the triggers. This is the tripwire for that review. So that's sitting in Congress. It's going to require getting rid of the filibuster, frankly, to be able to get this kind of voting rights protection as into law.
Right. So we do have more questions coming in online, but I want to make sure that we don't have any questions here in the room. I know I saw a couple people maybe moving down toward the microphone. If you do have a question, you can come on up. And go ahead, please.
I was meaning to ask, so how would you say this kind of treatment of voting would apply to electoral college? As we have seen with recent elections, especially Trump v. Clinton, it unfortunately comes down more to a less democratic way of electoral college rather than
popular vote.
Voting. So in the grand scheme, how do these kind of things fall down to the African American population, and how can we enhance their votes to count?
Yeah. And so one of the things that is happening, he's talking about the power of the Electoral College, where it's about getting 270 Electoral College votes in order to become President of the United States. So we have had instances where folks have not won the popular vote. George W. Bush lost by over 500,000 votes. And then Trump lost by almost 3 million votes and became President of the United States. And so you have this thing that has not fully come into being yet, which is the National Popular Vote Compact, which says that these states are getting together and they're saying that whoever wins the popular vote, that is how they're going to cast their electoral college votes. So we don't have this mismatch anymore. I think the states that have signed on were up to like 230 or so, something like that. So we're not at 270 yet. And so the electoral college undermines the popular will. It is part of minoritarian rule that we're seeing. We're seeing these fissures, these fault lines in the structure of American democracy, where the will of the majority can be just overridden, brutally overridden by a minority.
Question that came in online. Can you talk about barriers to vote for people with limited English proficiency? And then this person also asked about barriers to vote for Native American and indigenous populations on reservations.
Oh my God, yes. So one of the changes in the Voting Rights Act in 1982, I want to say it is, was to add language. So if you are in a jurisdiction that has, I think, 5% of your population being non-English speaking, then you have to provide your election materials in that language. And so there have been these cases coming through where you have these jurisdictions that are only providing their election materials in English-only forms. And so they have been sued. And so a lot of agitation is happening around that. These election officials, these political officials, having to be compelled to provide materials in Spanish, provide materials in Hmong, provide materials in the language of their citizens, so that their citizens can engage in this democracy. For indigenous people, you find these barriers. In North Dakota, Lord. So what you're seeing is me being really ticked right now. So breathe it through. In North Dakota, Native Americans rallied hard, and they elected, put into power Heidi Heitkamp as the U.S. Senator in the 2012 election. That was a shocker. And they also agitated against the pipeline coming through their territory that would affect the quality of their water and their soil. They mobilized. Well, the legislature was ticked with a capital T. And so the legislature rewrote the law on voter ID, saying that for your voter ID to be valid, it had to have a street address on it. Now, where that gets foul nasty is that 61% of Native Americans in North Dakota live on reservations, and reservations don't have street addresses. So that little bureaucratic flick just eliminated that population. That population fought back. You know, I have a chapter in One Person, No Vote. One of the last chapters called We Will Warrior Up. And that is a direct quote from one of the Native Americans who was like, no, we're not doing this. And so they got out all kinds of Google Maps and GPS systems to figure out what people's street addresses would be. They started melting printers, printing off new tribal IDs with these street addresses. The state came back saying, if we can't recognize your street address, this is voter fraud. This is a criminal act. So you can see how this bureaucratic language is designed to eliminate populations from access to the ballot box. In Arizona, the Brnovich decision, one of the things that Arizona did was it said you can't have all of this ballot harvesting, where you have people rounding up ballots and then taking them into the polls. Well, the nearest post office for many who live on the reservations is about 15 miles away. And so what would happen is that you would have somebody who would round up the ballots from the folks on the reservation and then take them to be dropped off. That has become illegal. So now it's saying basically everybody has to go that 15 miles to be able to vote. Those are the kinds of barriers that are there for the indigenous population.
Thank you. Let's go to a question over here.
Hello, my name's Olivia. I'm here with my wonderful class. But I was wondering, what is your opinion on the 2020 election with the stolen election and, voter fraud everywhere and just hearing about this conspiracy for months. I'd like to know what you think about it. Yeah. And also if you saw any voter suppression in the 2020 election.
Okay. Great questions. And it's just so you saw my face flinch. I lost my poker face at 31. It just went bye-bye. And so it's just all here. The language of the stolen election, I was like, Lord, this is the mess from 1890 all over again. And voter fraud. And so you had Newt Gingrich say on Fox News, they stole the election. They stole it in Philadelphia. They stole it in Milwaukee. They stole it in Atlanta. And I was like, what? They didn't steal it in Salt Lake City? So you can see how stolen elections become identified in cities that have sizable minority populations. And so it links the theft with blackness. It links the theft with the criminality of blackness that makes it reasonable. So of course they stole it. And that's what we continue to see. And so it's like, well, in Atlanta, in Fulton County, they had these suitcases of ballots. And with these suitcases, they had all of these ballots, and they kept pulling out these suitcases and counting and counting and counting. When they ran the actual footage, what they showed was that the poll workers thought that they could go home. It was 10:30 at night. They had been there since like 7 a.m. It was 10:30 at night. They thought they could go home. They put the ballots in the regulation suitcases to ballot boxes and put them under the table. When they got ready to leave, they were told, no, you have to go back and keep counting. So they went back, they pulled out those ballot boxes, and they kept counting. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation, the Secretary of State's office, and basically the Department of Justice all looked at this. There was no there. When you think about it, there were 60 lawsuits filed by the Trump campaign alleging massive rampant voter fraud. They stole it. And those cases were thrown out. And you've got Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell, who are being basically threatened with their law license right now for bringing these spurious cases before the courts. There's no there. But the thing about a lie is if you keep saying it over and over and over, it becomes the truth. Voter fraud, voter fraud. It's almost like saying Candyman 5 times, right? He's going to come up and just, voter fraud, voter fraud, voter fraud, voter fraud, voter fraud. And, there it is, right? So, and did I see voter suppression happening? Yeah, I saw the things about not having enough polling stations and enough poll workers, and so you end up with these 11-hour lines. Asking folks to stand in line for 11 hours to vote is inhumane. And a study was done over the primary in Georgia, and it showed that in counties that were 90% black or 90% minority, they had to wait in line almost 10 times as long as those precincts that were 90% white. That's voter suppression.
Great question, thank you. I think I see 2 more, or maybe we'll, those, we'll just go with the last 3 here that are in line at the microphone, please.
Sorry, I'm too short for this. Mine's kind of relevant and going off of that previous question. I was just wondering if you have any ideas on what we can do to reform this like new overarching idea that there's all this voter fraud, like we can't trust our electoral system, because I think, especially with kids my age now, I'm seeing that they're starting to believe these allegations that aren't based on anything. And I've been kind of feeling like, oh, it's just going to keep getting worse, like no one's going to ever have trust again. I'm just wondering if you have any ideas how we combat that new thought process.
Yeah, and this is part of the research that has been done on disinformation. It's like once the thing is out there, it's there. And it is resistant to evidence, unfortunately. But what we can continue to do is to tell the truth. And we can begin to really hammer in on what happens to this nation when we just say, I'm out, peace out, it's not going to change, there's nothing I can do. When we throw up our hands, we cede our power to someone else. And they then put our destiny in their hands. Are we willing to do that? Really? And so I would begin to have those questions about what does it mean when we don't engage? What are the consequences of that lack of engagement? Because the reason that voter suppression happens is because we do engage, and it is the fear of that engagement and what that engagement means that is driving these policies. And I'm like, be afraid. Be very afraid. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
This is also somewhat related, but do you believe that with increased public awareness of the true impact of these voting laws, will the increased pressure lead to positive policy outcomes, or will the growing fear of stolen elections maintain or worsen the status quo?
I think that as we have a greater sense of the dangers of the lie of a stolen election, that it allows us to then put pressure on our representatives to bring true election integrity to the ballot box. And that means to open up access to the ballot box, and that means also to strengthen the guardrails of democracy. Being in Georgia, You remember, this is where Trump called Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, saying, look, all you've got to do is just find me 11,780 votes. That's all you got to do. And Brad Raffensperger, who is a staunch Trump Republican, said no. The data do not support that. So one of the things that you have happening in the new legislation is to remove the power of the Secretary of State from elections. So now he's ex officio on the state election board. To remove those guardrails of democracy, those guardrails that said no to Trump when Trump tried to overturn the will of the voters. And so part of what we have to do is we have to make it clear to our elected representatives that we don't want those guardrails removed. We want them strengthened. We demand that they be strengthened. They need to hear from us.
Great. And last but not least,
Good evening, Professor A.
Hey.
Hey. So I'm just pulling a quick headline from 3 hours ago in the Philadelphia Inquirer.
Uh-oh.
Pennsylvania redistricting panel rolls back a new policy to count incarcerated people in home districts and not state prisons. And so in this, literally just in this area, but certainly throughout the state, we have 23 state correctional institutions. And so as we think about gerrymandering within the state of Pennsylvania, this really can make a difference one way or the other. So I just love your thoughts. You know I'm originally from Florida, so that whole, that's its own thing. But we've got some issues here in the state, and I'd love your thoughts around imprisoned populations, the way that the gerrymandering is working, the way that it's being used, and then perhaps things like this that can be done.
And so part of what happens, so I'm from Ohio originally, don't boo. And one of the things that I saw happening when I worked in state government were the incredible bids that were happening from counties trying to get the latest supermax prison, because that was going to bring jobs, jobs, jobs. What it also did, and most of these bids were happening in rural counties, and because of the way that the criminal justice system worked, it was sucking Black people out of the cities and criminalizing them and putting them in these rural counties. Then when the census would happen, when these head counts would happen, the folks who were in those prisons would be counted as residents of those rural counties, and then they would get the benefits in terms of representation, but also in terms of dollars for the people in that county. Whereas the home districts where these people were pulled out of, those people would not count. And so we see again the work of the criminal justice system in skewing our electorate. It is the way that felony disfranchisement worked. So when I talked about Florida, so when you have over 20% of Black adults in Florida not able to vote, and that includes 40% of Black men, it doesn't mean that Florida isn't counting those folks in terms of its representation in the census to figure out how many congressional representatives it could get. This was worse than the 2/3 clause. The 3/5 clause, sorry. This was worse than the 3/5 clause, because the 3/5 clause, you were counting Black folks as 3/5 in order for congressional representation during slavery. Here, you're counting Black people wholly for representation, and they still don't have the right to vote. So this was what's happening with felony disfranchisement was worse. And so that's how the criminal justice system begins to impact the right to vote in America.
Great. Well, we will leave it there. Please join me again in thanking Carol Anderson for a wonderful presentation today.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. And a reminder again, if you'd like to get a book signed, you can head on out to the lobby. We will be out there in just a few minutes. Thanks again, everybody.
And I swear.
Now is the time for all good men to get together with one another. Iron out their problems and iron out their quarrels and try to live as brothers. And try to find peace within without stepping on one another. And do respect of the women of the world. Just remember we all had mothers. Make this land a better land in the world in which we live. And help each man be a better man.